Hi class! In this video I'd like to talk about information interaction design and narrative architecture, but I want to talk about what they have to do with each other. I think it can be a little confusing at first to sort of figure out what Shedroff's concept of information interaction design and Jenkins' concept of these sort of spatial environmental storytelling procedures have to do with each other. So I want to kind of explain the relationship between these two things. And to do that, I'm going to call this lecture Authoring Choices. Because really, both of these readings that you had are about understanding how choices are made and why they're made when you're creating narratives, or even when you're creating any kind of digital story. And a digital story can be simple as a website that presents the story of a company or tells the story of a product or a brand. So the thing to remember when you're creating any kind of digital story is that you have goals and messages. So every digital story has a goal. This is what the audience is supposed to achieve. So the goal for a website selling a product might be as simple as, sell more of the product. In this class, we're going to focus on more sort of conceptual stories with conceptual goals. But every digital story, there's something the audience is supposed to get out of it. There's something they're supposed to do or understand. So some examples might be learning to collaborate online. I Love Bees was really about the audience learning to be a hive mind and figuring out how a hive mind works and why it's important. Yes, it was a promotional site, promotional experience, but that's not really what the goal was. The goal wasn't to promote Halo. Who cares? Who's gonna, would you play a game if someone said, hey, you should play this game, it promotes Halo? You would not do that. It has a larger, more conceptual goal, which is to learn to collaborate online. So if you were playing I Love Bees when it came out, you probably wouldn't tell someone, oh, this is a great story about, promoting Halo. You would say, this is a really interesting story. You have to make this hive mind. Like, we all have to work together to figure it out. So that's the goal. Another transmedia narrative that I would suggest you guys look up is World Without Oil. This is actually an ARG where each week the main hub site sort of had breaking news about the state of oil in the world. Basically, the idea was, we're eventually going to run out of oil. It's going to be in the next 100, 200 years, but let's pretend it's going to be right now. And so over, I think it was 32 weeks, each week they sort of sped up time and said, okay, it's very clear we're going to run out in the next 10 weeks. Oh my gosh, we got 9 weeks left. Oh, we've only got 8 weeks. And then during the experience, of course, one of the days of news was, all right, well, we're out of oil. And so the experience was meant to get people to support alternative energy and get people to understand that a world that is dependent on oil is not a well-organized world. It's not prepared for the future. So that was the goal of that experience. Another goal might be to build empathy for the mentally ill. We'll look at a screenshot from a interactive fiction game called Depression Quest. And the point of this interactive fiction is for the player to start to build empathy for people who suffer from depression and to stop seeing it as this sort of different thing that they can't possibly understand. So the goal of that game is to build empathy in the player and get them to sort of have empathy for their fellow men. Another goal might be, and you'll see I use this example throughout the class, learning about pet overpopulation and the role that shelters play in combating it. A lot of people really don't understand how shelters work. I've spent a lot of time volunteering in shelters, and I've always been surprised by the number of people who show up. And they're like, oh, will you take my cat? And we're like, no, we can't take it. We're full. And they're really confused. They're like, well, I thought you just found it. You just took everything and gave it a new home. And, we have to explain, no, we don't. We turn most of these cats away, and then about 70% of them go to the county shelter and get put to sleep. And people are like, what? That happens? They don't know that. So the goal of an experience might be to help people understand that and learn the truth of what's happening at shelters. And so these goals are what the audience is supposed to learn from or get out of the experience. not necessarily what the client's supposed to get out of it, not necessarily promotion or money. Messages support the goal. So messages are the pieces of information that you need to get out of the experience in order to support the goal. So if the goal is for me to learn about dependence on oil and why that's a negative and why I should care about alternative energy, there's going to be some messages that I need in order to achieve that goal. In order to be convinced that that's the case, I'm going to need some messages. I'm going to need to believe in these messages. So one, you can reduce your oil consumption. That needs to be a message that I begin to believe and understand. Two, you can support alternative energy through political action. So World Without Oil is not just about, hey, oil is going to run out, but helping people understand that they play a part in that because they consume oil and because they have political agency. In the pet adoption example, a series of messages might be, you really can save pets by adopting. It really does work. Another message might be, you can save your pets and other pets by spaying and neutering. It really does work also. So these are the two pieces of information that you need to know if you want to go out and make the world a better place for dogs and cats. So the unifying principle of your readings, information, interaction design, and narrative architecture, is really about authorial choices. It's about how the choices you make in planning your narrative design affect the user experience and in the end affect what message the audience gets. So the wrong choices can prohibit your audience from getting the messages that help achieve the goal, that help get the user to the goal. The right choices can support the goal in messages. So you have to make choices about how you organize and present information and what kind of story you tell, what kind of space for storytelling you have, and those choices have to allow your goal and message to thrive. So in information interaction design, when we conduct information interaction design and we figure out what information we're going to put where and how we're going to present it, we're really making three choices in three disciplines: information design, interaction design, and sensorial design. And the different choices we make in these different kinds of design that we undertake create different meanings. And we'll look at some examples. In narrative architecture, what Jenkins is writing about, we have a few choices. We have to decide what kind of space the story takes place in. So is this a very well-confined space with a traditional story that you just look at from beginning to end? Or is this a more experimental space where you have lots of freedom and you can kind of do what you want? You also have to decide who tells or creates the story. So how much control in that space does the author have, and how much control does the user have? So different choices create different kinds of experiences and support different messages and different goals. So if we look at what you saw previously, the breakdown of the information interaction design process, going from data to wisdom, what I want to make clear is that the first two steps, data and information, these are things that the author and designer deal with. So as you create a transmedia narrative in this class, you have to make decisions about data. You have to gather the data, you have to make decisions about it. Then you have to present and organize the information and make decisions about how you do that. But you make that part. The knowledge and wisdom happens in the hearts and minds of the audience. The audience is going to do these steps. The audience has to construct their own knowledge based on the data and information, and they have to construct their own wisdom from that knowledge. This is exactly what we're doing with the learning documents in this minor. With the learning documents, Brad and I curate the data and information. So we do the research, we gather the readings, we present the information, we organize it into modules, so we separate it into themes, hero's journey, communicating through storytelling, that kind of separation, that kind of organization, and we present it to you with examples and descriptions. But it's up to you guys to form knowledge from that. And the way we do that is we facilitate your ability to make knowledge. We use learning documents to do this. So we take care of the first two parts, data and information. We figure out what data we're going to use, how we can provide context for it and present it to you and organize it for you so that you can get the information. But it's up to you to create knowledge from that. So you have to write a learning document to create knowledge and show that you've understood the information and can make knowledge from it. But we're facilitating your ability to do that. So we designed the learning document assignment. We made a system for you to make knowledge in. We designed an experience, which is writing these documents and then having group meetings. We designed that experience, but it's up to you to take advantage of that experience to turn the information into knowledge. If you don't do the learning documents, if you don't participate in the group discussions, there's no way you're going to take that information and turn it into knowledge. So in this process, the author gathers and researches the data, presents it and organizes it, which converts it into knowledge, and then creates a system for turning that into knowledge. And that's all about experience, conversations, storytelling. This is where interactivity comes in. We take the information and we give you a way to interact with it. So when you write the learning documents and then you have conversations about them with your group, you're interacting with that information, and we've designed that interaction. You're participating in it. So let's look at this process from start to finish. So the first step is gathering and choosing data. Well, the data that you choose influences the meaning that the audience makes from your experience. So whether you're making a website or a transmedia narrative or a course on Blackboard, the data you choose influences the meaning. So in this class, there's very specific data that you're getting. For example, we're not covering social media. That's not a data point or set that's in this class. So that omission of data already sort of changes your experience of the class. You get a different meaning out of the class because we're not including social media. So you don't learn any meaning, you don't have any meaning making with social media. This is a concern that journalists run across. As a journalist, those of you who are journalism students, you will feel the pain here. You do so much research, you gather so much data. You might do weeks of research. I worked on an article once, it took me like 4 months of research. And then you write it, and your editor is like, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you, we just need 500 words. And you're like, okay, I have 10,000 words of interviews and data sets and points and information, and you want me to write 500 words. It's impossible. You have to decide what doesn't go in the article. And when you decide what doesn't go in the article, you automatically change the meaning of the article because you are cutting out some of the information. Your readers aren't going to know about that information, and so their view of your topic is limited already because you can't include it. You don't have enough space. So the data that you choose influences the meaning that the audience makes. And let's look at an example. Data itself doesn't facilitate learning. Nobody cares about data. It doesn't do anything. If we just gave you readings and there were no lectures and no learning documents, you wouldn't learn a thing. You would just read it and go, okay, whatever. Data does not facilitate, well, the readings even have more information, but if we just gave you data sets, if we just listed out like transmedia is this, cross media is this, embedded narratives are this, it wouldn't make any sense to you. That's data. It doesn't make sense on its own. Presenting data by itself is unlikely to express any kind of message or get any kind of point across. What you have to do is show patterns and relationships between data. So if we look at this data point, about 70 African elephants are killed each day by poachers. That's $25,000 a year. That's $25,000, 25,000 elephants a year. Okay, is that good or bad? If there's like 30,000 elephants, that's really not good. If there's 100 million elephants, then who cares? We need more data. We need to see comparisons. We need to see relationships and patterns. And so we need to compare with other data. So here's another piece of data about the similar topic. There are about 500,000 African elephants. Okay, well, that doesn't seem so bad. That's only 5% of the African elephants being killed every year. That's not good. I don't condone it, but it doesn't seem like it's going to wipe out the population, right? That doesn't seem so bad. Okay, well, let's look at this next data set. Okay, there were 3 to 5 million elephants 60 years ago. So in 60 years, we've more than halved the population of elephants in Africa. So maybe it's not so bad that we're only killing 5% a year, but it's kind of bad that we already, it doesn't seem like the trend is going well. It seems like the trend is going in the wrong direction. So the data by itself doesn't really make sense. It doesn't tell us anything. We don't learn from it. 70 a day, is that good? I don't know. It's only through the relationships and the patterns that we begin to understand the importance and the meaning of this data. So when you create a digital product, whether it's a website or transmedia narrative, you have to be really careful about how you present the data. If you wanted to, you could make a website that talks about how only 5% of elephants are killed every year. And if that's all the data you have, you create this really biased site. And people who see it go, well, that's not so bad. And they're not getting the full picture. So anytime you design a digital store, you have to be really aware of how your selection of data and your choices on how you compare and contrast it with other data affect the story that arises from that data and information. So to convert data into information, after you've decided what the data is that's going to be presented, you have to organize and present it. So data doesn't make sense to us, doesn't mean anything. We have to show relationships and we have to show patterns, and we do that by organizing the data and presenting that data. So the way you choose to organize the data has meaning. It influences the meaning that the audience makes. So how you organize the data turns it into information by showing the relationships and patterns, and you can do a good job of organizing it, and you can do a bad job of organizing it. So let's look at an example, and Shedroff talks about different ways of organizing data. Here on the right is a data set of the closest any of these planets ever get to the sun in our solar system. But this is listed in alphabetical order. So what do you learn from this? What is the meaning of this data? Honestly, I can't make any sense of it. It's really hard to see the relationships and the patterns. It's so confusing. As soon as I read one distance and move on to the next planet, I've already forgotten what I read before. So this doesn't make any sense to me. This data is organized alphabetically, and that's a poor choice here. If the point is for me to learn the distance of planets, I'm not doing that. This is a bad decision. If we simply organize it by location order instead, the meaning becomes so much clearer because I can see the relationships and I can see the patterns. So immediately I can tell that Mercury's closest to the sun. Okay, sounds like it's pretty hot there. Earth, third planet from the sun. Here's something that immediately catches my eye. Mars is 205 million kilometers away from the sun. Jupiter is 741. So there's a huge gap between Mars and Jupiter. So I can make sense of this data. It has meaning to me now because it's organized in a sensical way. It's organized in the best possible way to show distance, which is the goal, right? The goal of presenting this data set is for people to understand just how large the solar system is. Here's another example of information design. This is a screenshot from the application page on Ball State's website. And you can see it's in a specific order. So first, getting started, then apply online, and then manage your account. Okay, so obviously I need to read the first one, then I need to apply, and then I need to come back and manage my account. If the organization were different, so that's organized by step, by continuum. Do this, then this, then this. If I rearrange that information and I do it by reverse alphabetical order just because I feel like it, that's a bad decision because now it doesn't make any sense. The first thing I see on the page is manage your account. Okay, I'm immediately confused because I don't have an account. So right away, I'm like, okay, don't get this site, don't like it, over it. Then getting started, then apply online. It doesn't make sense. It's not the best decision of organization for this particular data. So I want to talk a little bit about an example that I don't have pictures for. But the way you choose to organize the data influences the meaning. When we organize the planets by location, it emphasizes distance. When we organize the application process by steps, it emphasizes order of steps, what to do. I participated a couple of years ago at Ball State in an experience, and I can't remember the name of it. A local group goes around the state and puts on this experience that is meant to simulate poverty. It's like a poverty simulation. And this is a great example for the kind of thing you can do in transmedia too. The organization of data within the experience was very true to life. So we were all, you show up and you get assigned to a fake family, so there's like 3 people in your group, and you get a packet of information, and it has some data like, this percentage of people live in poverty, this percentage of people who are born into poverty never escape it, this percentage of people who are on food stamps, run out of eligibility within this many years, and, okay, yeah, the data, it seems not good, but that doesn't really teach you anything. You look at it and you're like, oh, that's kind of bad. The way the experience is set up, you start to interact with that data. So one piece of data is that services for people who are living in poverty are often not centralized, and this leads to a lot of wasted time. So people are always kind of like, well, if people are poor, why don't they just go get jobs? Well, if you are living in poverty, the amount of time it takes to go from place to place, just managing basics, is insane. And this experience emphasizes that by placing around the room different tables of services that you have to go to. And in order to get to the services, you have to have a bus ticket. And to have a bus ticket, you got to buy it. So the first thing you got to do when you start this experience is go to the damn bus station. They give you a little bit of money to start with. You got to buy bus tickets. You have no idea how many you're going to need because you're just starting. You have no clue. You have to go to work, you have to go get groceries, you run out of bus tickets, so the next thing you got to do is go stand in line at the damn bus station, and you end up standing in line at the bus station for so long trying to get a freaking ticket that you literally get nothing done for the day, and you go home and you have like no food to feed your kids, and it's super frustrating, and you start to actually feel that data. Instead of just being told, oh, it's really hard for people who live in poverty who have to ride the bus all the time to get the social services they need because they literally are really far apart, okay, that sounds bad. But when you're doing this experience and you're standing in line at a table for a fake bus ticket for 10 minutes, you start to get a little pissed off and you start to see exactly what this data point is about and what it means for the people who actually live it. So the data points are sort of organized into this spatial environment that mimics the real life of a person living in poverty. So this takes facts about poverty and turns it into an experience from which I made meaning. And it was much more successful than just giving me something to read. In transmedia narratives, transmedia stories are told across platforms. So your challenge in this class is to figure out how you're going to organize the story across platforms. How do people get the info, and how can that method mirror the goal? You have to help people see or experience the relationships and the patterns in data. So if you have one site in your transmedia narrative where you just dump everything on it, and then you have like a Facebook feed, and you just sort of, your Facebook feed says, go look at the site, that's not doing anything to organize the data in a meaningful way. You want to be able to organize the data in a way that means something. So if you're trying to recreate how hard it is to live in poverty, you're going to take that data and you're going to spread it all over so that you can see just how frustrating it is to have to run around and do all this crap that people who live in middle-class families don't have to do. If you are trying to tell the story of what it's like to live in Darfur, where you have to literally get up in the morning and go get water, and you have to walk hours to go get it, then your transmedia narrative needs to express that. You need to organize the system in such a way that if part of the experience is for me to kind of feel what it's like to be that person, maybe I go to a website and there's a pop-up that says, sorry, you gotta wait 3 hours, because then I'm gonna feel the frustration that you would feel if you were living the life of the person in Darfur who you're supposed to be learning about. Now, the way you choose to present the data influences the meaning also. How you present the data is how you turn it into information along with organizing it, and this is where sensory design comes in. So I want to talk really quickly about the cone of experience. Edgar Dale in the 50s was a learning technologist. He was a teacher studying education, and he was trying to explain to other teachers how you can't just give people stuff to read. In the 50s, this was revolutionary. Now I think it's pretty well accepted, although some of you are probably rolling your eyes going, no, I have professors who just give me shit to read all the time. But he was kind of saying, you can't just give people stuff to read all the time. That's not how you learn. You don't learn from just reading a bunch of stuff. You have to do something with it. You have to have some kind of experience. You have to have some sort of sensory experience or some sort of interactive experience. And he created this cone to kind of explain the effect of different levels of sensory experience, and then sensory media, and then experience. So at the top, verbal symbols, visual symbols, so words, images, recordings, motion pictures, television, exhibits. These are pretty not interactive. These are sensorial. So these are media that are fixed. These are pictures, text, videos. Sensory media, but sensory media that's in a fixed form. And he says, motion pictures, images, they're better than just text. But there's more. You can do more. And he came up with this idea of inactive experiences. So he said we shouldn't just be giving kids stuff to read. We should be taking them out on field trips. We should be taking them to role-playing experiences. We should be taking them to interactive history parks and giving each of them a role and showing them what life is really like for their history lesson. So Dale sort of theorized that direct, purposeful experiences and contrived experiences were the best way to learn. And this is learning by doing. This is the immersive learning that Ball State does. This is where this comes from, this idea that you learn by doing. So if we want to prepare students for the real world, let's just have them go out to the real world and do stuff. And at the time in the 50s, this was like mind-blowing. Right now, I feel like everyone kind of accepts, yes, if you are trying to learn something, you should probably go do it. But this is a theory of how people learn and gain knowledge that you can use in your transmedia narratives. So it helps you sort of prioritize sensory experiences or sensory media and experiences. Sometimes you want sensory media because it's symbolic or iconic. It sends a message very, very clearly. A picture of someone who is sad and crying sends a very clear message of sadness and crying. A video of something happening sends you a very clear message of the plot. So sometimes you do want sensorial media. Sometimes you need that. You need to have some symbolism. You need to have iconic images. You need to just explain what's going on. But sometimes you want interactive experiences, and this is where interaction design comes in. You have to figure out when it's appropriate to show and when it's appropriate to have someone experience something. So sometimes you do want sensorial media, and sometimes you want enacting media experiences. You want people to actually do things in order to mimic the kind of information that they should be learning. So if we apply sensorial media and this idea of interaction to our example of the solar system, we already established that location order helps us understand this data better. But we can take this further with sensorial media. So text, sure, I get it. But this picture helps me get it more. What I didn't see when I saw this text, what I didn't really realize was how everything gets really spread out toward the end. I noticed that there was a big jump between Mars and Jupiter, but I didn't realize how spread out the rest of the planets were. And yes, I'm keeping Pluto on here, not a planet anymore. I know. I love in my heart for Pluto. This helps a lot. So going from text to image already is getting us lower down on the cone. So that's making it, helping us gain knowledge. Remember that knowledge, it happens in the mind of the audience. And how you present the information can spur the knowledge. So this increases my understanding of this information in a way that the text didn't really. But let me blow your minds for a second, because how can we make this better? Well, let's go further down the cone. We did verbal symbols, that was fine. We did visual symbols, that was better. Let's do an interactive experience. So this is a website called If the Moon Were 1 Pixel. And it is a visual presentation of the same data we just saw in text and image format. Okay, scroll to explore. Here's the sun. We're going to scroll until we see the next planet. And Mercury. Look how far away it is. Look how tiny it is. By giving me this interface that's interactive, I really get the sense of space in the solar system now. The text didn't really fully understand it. I went, oh yeah, look at the distances. The picture, I started to get a better sense. But this interactive, where I have to scroll and it gets really tedious, I start to really understand just the vastness of the solar system. Let's keep going. Oh, Mercury. Yeah, things are far apart. Planet soon. Awesome. Venus. There it is. All right, a little bit bigger. And scrolling. Earth. And the moon. The moon is 1 pixel. So if the goal for any of these space communications is to help people understand the vastness of the solar system, this is the most successful. It uses sensorial media, these little, dots in this blackness of space, but it uses interactivity. And it allows me to interact with the media so that I can really get a sense of the space. Let's talk about transmedia narratives. So the way you choose to present the data influences the meaning. How you present the data turns into information. So in transmedia narratives, that means creating a presentation style and choosing the right sensorial, and I'm going to put sensorial media and interactions that support your message and increase understanding of the information. So if we go back to my example of Stop Mittens, if we did a transmedia narrative that was meant to get people excited about adopting animals with the ultimate goal of teaching people that, like, don't go dump your damn cat at the shelter because it's not going to end well, and getting people to just really understand what is happening at shelters and how they can stop it and make the world a better place for animals, if we go back to that example, I have to make some choices. What might be good for sensorial media? What might be good for interactive media? And with these interactions too, I showed an actual interactive interface, but with interactions you can have conversations too. So I could have a forum. I could encourage people to talk to each other. I could encourage people to post pictures of their own cats and participate in a conversation. So it's not just interface, it's also interfacing with people, talking to other people and being social. So if I go back to that example of the shelter, I have to kind of figure out, what do I want to make sensorial and what do I want to make experiential and interactive, either through conversations or having people actually interact with technology in some way, and what do I maybe not want to present in that way. I know for sure I don't want to present like death and doom for the whole narrative. So I have to make a decision about what's going to be presented in sensorial media and what's going to be presented in interactive media, and I decide not to include that at all. And that decision is going to change the meaning. It used to be really popular in the animal welfare movement to have just like really offensive and disgusting images of animals being hurt or like, being put to sleep. And people used to think that was the way to go. And what they found is that the meaning the audience got from that wasn't agency. It didn't make people feel like they could do anything. It just made people sad. And it didn't actually make them feel like they could contribute and that they had any agency in that situation. So the way you present the story, either with sensorial media or interaction, determines the message people get out of it and whether or not you can achieve the goal. So making doom and gloom, oh my God, dogs and cats are being killed, it's not going to achieve my message. It's not going to achieve my goal. So I have to make sure I'm making decisions that stay away from that. The final step in the process is wisdom. So as the author, you're going to decide the data, package it into information by presenting it clearly and presenting it in different ways, interactive means and sensorial media means, and organizing it well so that it's easy to understand. And then you're going to facilitate knowledge by creating interactive spaces, by creating conversational spaces, by getting people to think about and play with the information, get their hands dirty with the information, try it out. But I'm just facilitating that. So I, as a designer, I kind of stop at information, and now instead of designing the information in the data, I design a system for people to gain knowledge themselves. And wisdom is kind of the same. I can facilitate the gaining of wisdom, but I can't make it. I can't force anyone to have it. So knowledge comes from experiencing the information, not just consuming it. Wisdom is the same. So if I want to give the audience knowledge, I have to give them a space to create knowledge and wisdom. And they're going to do that by doing and then reflecting. So to create knowledge, I take that information and I develop conversations and stories around it, or I let people tell their own stories as part of conversation. I let people make things. I let people try things out. I let people contribute. I let people have digital interactives where they can click buttons and they can scroll and they can sort of play with the information with their mouse. I might use role playing where people get to play characters. They get to make their own character that represents something to them. I told you we would look at an example from Depression Quest, and this is such a smart interactive fiction piece because at the bottom of each chapter you are presented with a scenario. You get more and more depressed as you go through, and you get sort of at the bottom, these gray bars tell you what's going on in your life. You're very depressed. Here's what's going on. You're not sleeping. You hate yourself. You don't have any motivation. You're not seeing a therapist. You're not taking any medication. And so what you see is you're presented with choices, and these two blue ones are clickable, and the two red ones are crossed out, and they're not clickable. And this was such a good decision because what this has done is the author has given choices and taken some of them away, and that's exactly what you experience when you're going through depression. You literally feel like you don't have certain choices. And so this mimics the life of someone, the perspective of someone who's going through depression. So the data is based on research about depression. The symptoms that we know it causes in people, the feelings that we know it causes in people, but it's turned into information through sensorial design, through text stories that we read, and then we interact with it by making choices, but our choices are limited, which mirrors the life of someone who's depressed. So it's such a smart way of presenting how the stories moved along. Another quick example of interaction and how you can use it to create knowledge. This is a screenshot from the NSA Files Decoded, an award-winning narrative on The Guardian. And it's part of a whole big multimedia set, but at one point the story talks about 3 degrees of separation and explains that the NSA is allowed to travel 3 hops from its targets. So if they suspect that I have been engaged in illegal activities, they are allowed to tap into my information. They're allowed to tap into my mom's information because she's a hop away from me. And then they can tap into a friend of my mom's information because that's the 3rd hop away from me, even if I don't know that friend. And so what's so brilliant about the way this was presented is they sort of give you context and they let you interact with that information. So the data is you can move 3 hops, but what does that really mean? Well, here you can see that most people on Facebook have 190 friends. So if the NSA were looking at your Facebook and they could go 3 hops, they could reach 50 people just in the first degree. And then if they did the second hop, they could reach 8,000 people. If they did a third hop, they could reach 1,300,000 people. So if they're allowed to do 3 hops, just from you with 3 hops, that means they're allowed to investigate 1.3 million people because they're 3 hops away from you. Obviously, the message here is that their reach is highly overextended. What's so brilliant about this piece is it's interactive. So I click log into Facebook and it pulls my Facebook data and it tells me that personally I have 752 friends. So first hop would get the NSA to 752 people. That's more than fit on a 747. It's more than a 747 full of people. A second hop means that they could look at and follow and get data on more than the population of Provo, Utah. A third hop, and suddenly they can get information, they can get communications data from 20 million people. So basically what this means is they could pretty much get information for anybody they want. If they could, 20 million people can be investigated just because of me. So if they just pick 1,000 people that they wanna investigate, they can now investigate almost all of America. So really great interactive that takes the data and contextualizes it by making it interactive and applying it to my life, personalizing it, which you also read about in Shedroff. So knowledge comes from experiencing, again, the information, not just consuming it. So you have to give the audience a space to create knowledge by doing it. In transmedia storytelling, that means designing a system of participation that gives the audience a space. So you have to figure out where the audience is going to form their knowledge. They get the data, they get the information, which means they understand what's happening in the story. They understand the messages. They understand the characters. They understand the plot points. You need a space for them to work it out, to talk about it, to figure out what it all means. So you have to design some kind of space. So as you work on your transmedia narratives in this class, if you don't design a space for your audience to communicate or interact, you're not doing it right. And I'll tell you, I'll sort of suggest, you don't really have any knowledge building here. You've got the story, but where are people supposed to participate? Where are people supposed to make sense of all of this? And again, the last step, wisdom. Again, you can't make people get wisdom. You can only facilitate it. And wisdom is controlled by the audience. It comes from reflection. So in this class, your last assignment will be a post-mortem. You have post-mortem in pretty much all of the digital media minor classes, and that's where you reflect on your experience, and that's where I expect you to have developed some wisdom. In your transmedia story, you want to do the same. You're going to create a system that asks for self-reflection. So at some point in your narrative, you might go to that community that's building knowledge and ask them for some self-reflection. Or maybe at the end, you have self-reflective practices. So the story is over, the audience saved the day or whatever, and you open a new site that says, tell us what you learned, tell us what happened, tell us about your experience. And that's where people can sort of try to work out the knowledge to wisdom. So again, the unifying principle between information interaction design and narrative architecture is how the choices you make in planning your design affect the user experience and in turn what message the audience gets and whether or not they can achieve the goal. Bad choices can prohibit your audience from getting the messages. Good choices, the right choices, not objectively but for what you're doing, support the goals and messages. So real quick, let's talk about narrative architecture. Choices are made in the space the story takes place in and who tells or creates the story. So you control, it's like you have knobs and you control the space, how the space is designed, and then you control the freedom of the audience to tell a story. So Jenkins is really advocating that instead of thinking about stories as these really specific acts and scenes and first act 1, then act 2, then act 3, exposition, rising action, denouement, instead of having to have all these, he says, why do we think of stories like that? Why does a story have to be a complete beginning to end? Can't we just have narrative-like things? Can't we just imagine stories as being elemental of narrative and maybe not completely prescribed by an author? This is exactly what transmedia is getting at. And so he comes up with 4 types of stories that come out of spaces. So part of your work in this class is to figure out the space in which your narrative takes place. What is the world like? What is the space? Is it mostly real world or is it mostly online? Is the world complete alternate reality or is the world the same as the world we're already in? And you have to build this space. And so in evocative spaces, the space just evokes a prior or shared story. So there's not a complete narrative. You're just evoking the sense of a story that someone already knows. So the Star Wars games, the Star Wars franchises, a lot of times they do this. When you play a Star Wars game, the game is not going to start at the beginning and tell you who Darth Vader is and who Luke is. You're just going to start with Luke and Darth Vader, and you're kind of expected to know who they are. So this is an evocative story. You're just sort of expected to know who these characters are and what this world is already like. You're not going to get the whole narrative. The backstory you're supposed to know already. In enacting narratives, the audience plays the lead in micro-narratives. So the audience this is very game-like. You can think of playing a game, you enact the game. You're the main character and you play it, and each level is like a little micro story. And sometimes the games literally are different micro stories. You can play as different characters and their stories are different. Embedded narratives are when the audience just pieces together a prepackaged story or set of stories. So embedded is the idea of you write the story out, you chop it up, and you place it in the game, or in your case, you place it around different media. So you can have a transmedia experience that's embedded, where the audience doesn't really contribute to the story. They just have to ferret the story out, figure out what's happening, and find all the pieces and make sense of it. But they're not participating, and that's totally valid. If you want to do a story like that, go for it. The opposite would be emergent. So the audience creates the story. That would be a transmedia narrative world where you create the characters or like the character types. World of Warcraft is emergent. You have character types. Elves. I clearly don't play World of Warcraft. Dwarfs, that kind of thing. But the audience makes the story. There's people who play World of Warcraft and they just farm, and that's what they love to do, and to them the story is farming. There's other people who love to form guilds and to go on raids and things like that, but you get to pick. The world is made, the character types are there, but you do the rest. Now, the problem with these is that the type of space you create determines the audience experience. So to create an emergent narrative, you just create the world, the objects and character types in it, and maybe some rules like don't kill each other, and then you just set people loose in it. This is World of Warcraft, this is Second Life, The Sims, that kind of thing. To create embedded narratives, you would have to tell multiple stories from start to finish, chop them up, and place them out in media somewhere. So you determine the level of audience control based on which of these type of stories you decide to make. So one of the first things you're going to do in your group is figure out which of these stories you want to make. Is your narrative embedded? Is it emergent? Is it evocative? And you're going to tell me that. The last thing I want to talk about is just the concern here. There are cons of each of these types of stories. If you create an emergent space where people can make their own narratives, it's very hard to ensure that the audience actually gets the message you want. World of Warcraft is a good example. Is there a message to World of Warcraft? Well, you kind of make the message you want. If you like raiding, it's a game about raiding. If you like farming, it's a game about farming. So the trade-off with emergent narratives, if you go completely emergent, is you can't really control the message. There's no guarantee that people will do what you want them to do. They probably won't. If you're in social media, you'll learn that there's people who just like to screw stuff up because they can. So there's danger there. But there's also danger in embedded narratives. Embedded narratives, they can be hard to create experiences that lead to knowledge creation. So you have to get a little more creative with your interactivities, with your conversations that you have around things. Embedded narratives, people go find them. There's less drive for those people to form groups and collective intelligences. There's less drive for them to talk about their experiences because they know their experience is the same as everyone else's or similar to everyone else's. In evocative spaces, you really have to be sure that you're drawing on a general concept of a franchise or a shared story because people have to know the backstory coming in, and if they don't, the story's not going to make sense to them. Enacted stories, you have to make sure that people understand why completing the narratives is important so that they don't just do a couple and get bored and then they don't get your message. They have to understand the connection between the narratives, and they have to understand why being a part of it matters. So some considerations as you think about which of these kinds of narratives you want to make your transmedia narrative into. That's everything I wanted to say. I'm sorry this was a really long-winded discussion, but I think that these two readings really necessitate some examples and some further breakdown so that you can understand what they have to do with each other, which is designing choices, figuring out how you're going to set up this transmedia narrative so that people can learn and get the message, but they can also have some amount of control, or at least know whether it's evocative, enacted, embedded, at least know what their control is.